right, so we begin today's sharing. This is the third and the last session of my I call it a little learning design in action series. So today we've already covered the more pragmatic side of things, how to manage your learning design as a project. And also we talked a lot about the pedagogical side of things in the cognitive learning design session. So today we're going to talk about probably the most high level and also the most challenging bit of learning design, which is design for collaborative and also social metacognitive performances. Now, judging by the fact that I'm even having trouble pronouncing that long word makes me a little bit unconfident about talking about this topic, because collaborative and social metacognitive is something that really we want to achieve with learning design, but they are really, really challenging. So my sharing today is, again, based on some of the attempts we have made in our own design, and also some experiences drawn from the literature, hopefully to shed some lights into the work you're doing, the designs you're creating. But ultimately, it comes down to a lot of practice, a lot of experience for you to design a really effective collaborative project, and also create a social metacognitive norm of collaborative environment. So today, we're going to follow a very similar kind of learning process. We'll begin with a very important kind of mental status is to acknowledge collaboration as a learning outcome. Now, I'll explore more what this statement means, but that's our goal to set up in the beginning. And then we'll go through some of the design principles to design collaborative activities, and then introduce a framework that is the most academic framework I have introduced in these 3 sessions, the community of inquiry model. And then we'll go through a design process of a collaborative learning tool that we have developed in-house. In fact, Nancy was also co-I in that project that we're currently working on for a learning design interface on collaborative tasks. And finally, we'll touch a bit on the social metacognitive side of things, and then talk about the building the collaborative norm in your learning experience. So to begin with, we'll look at this image on the screen. Now, this is just a simple comic drawing illustrating the importance of collaboration. On this image, we see everyone's holding a long spoon. They're trying to get that delicious soup out of the big pot, but apparently everyone's struggling. And then once we figured out this innovative way of feeding each other, everyone has soup, everyone's happy. Now, when I talk about collaboration as a learning outcome, what I'm trying to get everyone on board on this concept is that oftentimes we talk about learning outcomes, we think about the cognitive learning outcomes. We think about what we want students to learn in terms of subject matter, in terms of the skills within the subject. We want students to be able to code, to be able to write a paragraph of nice essay. But whenever we talk about collaboration, we kind of jump into the assumption that by assigning a group work, we're teaching students collaboration. Now, in this comic, although we look at the right side of the photo, everyone seems happy. But if we ask these people, what did you learn? If this is a learning task, and we interview these people after this process, what would they say they have learned? Most likely they say, oh, we need to help each other. Some may say the soup is delicious. And some may say that you need to think out of the box, use tools differently. So as you can see, without a clearly defined task to perform. Now, we look at these images, we don't know what exactly they're trying to achieve. What is the goal of this task? Is it to feed everybody? Is it to make sure that everyone gets soup, or some particular people get soup, or to finish the soup as soon as possible? Now, without this clearly defined task, it's almost impossible for these participants to get out of this collaboration any meaningful insights. So here I want to emphasize that by defining collaboration as a learning outcome, we want to be able to provide a detailed design with clear instruction and means of assessment to assess their collaboration. So by the end of the collaborative task, they will be able to say, okay, in this process, I did not just learn the content, I did not just learn the skills, and at the same time, I learned the importance of collaboration and how to collaborate with others. Now, those sounds like a very mouthful statement. So hopefully by the end of this session, you will have a better understanding of what it requires to design a course targeted towards collaboration. So here is an image of, it's a very dark image, but I want to illustrate the concept of, if we look at the task just now, the soup feeding task just now, it was very straightforward. We just need to feed each other. And in that context, most likely it doesn't take much thinking to perform the task, which means the collaboration there doesn't seem that valuable. We're just doing something that we're also able to do ourselves, but with the help of each other, maybe it's a little faster or maybe not. So here is the first point I do want to get across, is that collaborative learning requires a very complex task design. What I mean by complex task is that when you look at the problem itself, you don't know where to begin. Just like the background image, if this is a task, if this is a problem set, you don't really know where to begin. And that's what we want with a collaborative task. And that's what we want to, that's where we can develop students' collaborative skills, is by having them to identify the problem and figure out the solution, and then help each other in this process. Now, when we talk about collaborative activities, there are a lot of design principles that we have to consider. But first of all, collaborative activity. The fact that collaboration is a learning outcome means that when we design activities that are collaborative, we also need to consider all of those design principles we have covered in the cognitive learning outcome. Which means if we're designing a collaborative activity, we want to consider the setting, we need to consider the expectation, we need to consider the resources, and these are not just resources to provide content knowledge, but also resources to help them collaborate. When they encounter any difficulty, when they are in a conflict, can they go to the teacher and say, we are having trouble discussing, can you help us out? And assessment and feedback, how do you assess their collaboration? What is the criteria of a good collaborator? Now, this is not just about whether they can perform well in this task. Maybe someone did not contribute that much intellectually, but they are able to help the group together and help each other to form a very supportive discussion. That's a very big contributor to the collaboration. So again, if we want to develop students' collaboration skills, we need to have clear metrics to assess those skills. Now, this is the exact same page as I talked about last time in the cognitive design principles. So these are the foundation principles when we design collaborative tasks. But the fact that, I'm sorry, let me switch that off. Okay. So what makes collaborative tasks special is, just now I talked about how collaborative tasks needs to be complex, needs to be very sophisticated. And that means when we try to tackle a collaborative problem, it requires certain skills. It requires certain steps before we reach the final outcome. Now, here is a very good summary that I like to refer to. Collaboration in learning means that getting students to work together and to achieve compromises. This is something that we don't observe very often when we are designing a collaboration. We don't think about what compromises they need to make. But in fact, I'm sure from your own learning experience, from your own group work experiences, you have made tons of compromises. You had amazing ideas, but you couldn't deliver because you didn't have the skill set, you didn't have enough time. This is a very critical part of collaboration. And it's a critical part for students to realize that they have to make such compromises in order for the group project to be delivered. And then after making the compromises, they need to figure out to get the best possible results from solving this problem. Now, the best possible results here, if we refer to an engineering term, we call it optimal result. Now, optimal is not best. Optimal means the best consider all factors. So here again, it's about making the compromise, taking the necessary steps in order to reach a final goal. If we refer back to in the first session when I talked about the project management approach, when the project team needs to identify the strategic goal, this is exactly where we want students to focus on when we talk about collaboration. Your goal now is not to show who is the smartest, but instead, how can we work together to achieve that shared strategic goal that we set out in the beginning. Now, these are all very philosophical concepts that are all sounds very correct, but how exactly can we do that? Again, here is just some general design principles. It's definitely not exhausting. It doesn't mean that by ticking all of the boxes, you'll be able to design a flawless collaborative task, but I believe this is where we can start from. Now, first of all, whenever we think about a group project, the immediate thing is to think about the size of the group. Now, last week I also mentioned that when we design group work, we need to consider what size is suitable. Now, generally speaking, for any collaborative tasks that are, I just remembered one thing. Before we go through these principles, I would like to invite everyone to think about the collaborative activities you are currently designing for your own course. And keep that in mind as we go through these principles. Think about your design and how much of the principles are your design following and how much of the principles that you haven't considered. So coming back to group size. Now, maybe you are designing your own group work. Maybe you are designing for kindergarten or for K-12 students or university students. Whichever group you're designing for, literature and also our practical experiences recommend that the group size of 4 to 5 is the optimal size. Now, any group size that's under 4, 3 people, sometimes you're struggling with the workload. And any size over 5, 6, 7 people, we often see either the groups become 2 subgroups, or sometimes you have freeloaders because the 5 people might be able to take up all of the tasks. So you gave the space for people who are less motivated to free ride. So 4 to 5 people is usually the ultimate number for effective group work. And then diversity. If you are talking about younger students, you might consider their gender, race, nationality, their family background. And if you're designing for a university, perhaps their major and their own learning background. This is also important because when we think about collaboration, we want each player of the team to bring what they to bringing their own specialties, to bring their expertise into this discussion. And also in this process, we want students to appreciate each other's diversity. And having teacher to mediate this process is beneficial for them to really establish what we set up as our goal in the beginning, to achieve effective collaboration through this diversity. And next consideration is trust. Now, you cannot have a very effective group without trust within each other. But this is not something philosophical. We do have some techniques to help achieve that fast. First of all is with my own teaching, also it's recommended by literature that you have an icebreaking activity in the beginning. And the goal of the icebreaking is not just to get each other to know one another, but most importantly, to establish appreciation for each other. So what I usually like to do in the icebreaking session is either to have students find some common grounds between each other, find 5 things you have in common, and share with each other something that you're most proud of, one of your achievements, something that you have done beautifully in the past semester or in the past year. Now, by doing this, you have group members appreciating each other, looking at each other as a valuable assets of the team. That's a very strong start for building an effective group. And also give it time. Now, there's literature showing that collaboration is most effective after 5 hours of contact. What does that mean is that even if you have the best students in the world, just by putting them together is not going to get them started right away. And for them to have strong enough rapport to establish an effective project or effective activity, you need enough time to spend together. That's why in our classroom and in my own classroom and in some of the designs I recommend to teachers, even if they're not doing group work, the students are still set in groups in a round table. So all the time they are with their group, they're with their group mates, they are trying to establish this rapport, this emotional connection with each other before they really go on to deliver their group project. So give it time for the trust to build up to a certain level so they can do something more effective. Now, next is once you have the trust established, you want to maintain it by keeping an open and supportive communication. Now, open means that we want to be able to share whatever thoughts you have, and supportive means there's no judgment, there's no criticism. Now, the way to do this is at the beginning, you want to set up some ground rules. You want to communicate clearly to students what are the words that we don't use. For example, this is not good enough. This is not what we want. This is you're being stupid or whatever it is. So these are some things that it sounds like we're managing a kindergarten classroom, but most of the times even adults need to be reminded of certain ground rules so that they can behave more supportive and more positively. And also it's important to keep the communication channel clear and also emphasize on the frequency of communication. Now, this can be done through setting up an example as an instructor. When you design the activity, you want to tell students how frequent you will be online to check their report, check their progress, and also how frequent you would recommend the group to meet together to discuss their progress. All of this communication, this frequent communication will help students to maintain the momentum and continue building on the trust that they have established. Now, lastly, sometimes when you have a large enough task, you might want to help students to assume certain roles so that they can establish their own accountability. Now, sometimes why students freeload is not because that they don't want to contribute, is that they don't have the clear framework of what they can do for the group. Now, some groups might lack the ability to establish clear roles themselves. So for a larger scale project, you might want to consider setting up those roles beforehand. So when they start their group work, they can assume certain roles and then continue to function what is expected out of the rules. Now, all of these considerations and design principles are for more sort of logistic side of things. And now we want to talk a bit more on the task design itself. Now, the top recommendation is to use real world problems. Sometimes the most obvious reason that students find group work or group project a bit daunting and less exciting is the fact that the task itself is not complex enough to engage so many people. We sit down together 5 minutes, we have a solution because a hypothetical scenario is often easy, it's often simple enough, straightforward, and there is a clear answer to it. So we want to use complex and authentic materials. So in this case, the most authentic learning scenario comes from the real world. So you might want to bring some real world problems to your classroom. One example is the teacher from Hong Kong U, a law professor from Hong Kong U. He's using a newspaper as a case study for all of his collaborative tasks. So when we sit down today, we look at the newspaper, we look at the story, identify the legal issue in this news story. Now, unlike the makeup law test, there is no clear defined tort issues or duty of care. You have to be able to identify those problems from the news articles yourself. Now, this is what is required for a legal professional when they enter their professional life. So examples like this exist in most of the in a lot of professional educations. So think about the task and also the learning outcomes you want to achieve, and then think about how you can connect that with a real world problem. And next is something that if you're a school teacher, you're most familiar with is use scaffolding. Now, scaffolding means that you provide timely support to the teams and members, but the support is gradually reduced as they progress to a higher level. Now, what I like to use is to use prompting questions rather than giving straight answers. Now, whenever we do collaborative work in the classroom, beforehand, I would give myself a few check-in points. So at certain time point, I will go to each group and see whether they are where they should be at this point. If they are a little bit far behind, I will ask a few prompting questions, trying to get them to the point where they should be, and then allow them to move forward from there. So use scaffolding in a collaborative task also means that you need to scaffold their their collaboration by asking whether you have included everyone in this process, who is taking what role, and have you fulfilled your role in that aspect. And then providing feedback, again, not just feedback on the content, but also feedback on how well they have worked as a team. Now, this is two-way feedback, meaning not just you, the instructor and the instructional designer, observing how the students are doing, but also providing students with a clear feedback channel, how they can reach out to you if they encounter problems with their collaboration. Oftentimes, students might need your help with resolve conflicts or identify problems or evaluate their solutions. Now, this is critical for helping them to move forward from where they are and then to eventually develop their project. And lastly, assessment. Like I just mentioned, collaboration also requires certain metrics to assess. And here the assessment is emphasizing the process rather than the final project. So what is the criteria of a good team player? All of these design considerations can be taken into evaluating what a good team player is, whether they are a good listener, whether they have whether they have taken up their role as they assumed, and whether they have kept a good communication with the members. All of these can be observed in the process of collaboration. But I have to admit that even up to now, even with my own teaching, even with our own collaborative tasks, we still haven't quite figured out a very good metrics for measuring collaboration. Some of our assessment rubrics are assessing on the behavior level of how much they are contributing. Some of them are based on peer feedback from their group mates. But we're trying to use multiple sources of observation to evaluate each member's participation in the group work, hopefully to have a fair judgment of their collaboration. Now, as I mentioned, this list is definitely non-exhausting. You can have a lot more considerations depending on what task you're designing and which age group and what are the student characteristics. But all in all, if you take these into consideration, at least you will have the awareness of what you need to build into a group project for students to really learn how to collaborate in this process. Now, just now, I asked everyone to think about your own project as you are going through these principles. Can I have a quick show hand or anything, or anyone if you would like to share with me, is your collaborative task online or face-to-face? Anyone, any group? Or as you're going through these principles, were you thinking about a online collaborative task or were you thinking about a face-to-face collaborative task?
Or you can use the chat box to indicate.
Right. Okay. So while we have wait for people to enter your input, this is what I found when I searched collaborative learning in Shutterstock. Shutterstock is a stock image website. This is where we source beautiful images. Quite obviously, whenever people think about collaborative learning, we think about a group of people sitting at a round table, standing in front of a whiteboard, putting post notes on it. This is the stereotypical understanding of collaboration. But we are also e-learning designers. We're also designing online learning experiences. And we know all the benefits of collaboration. So we are confronted by the challenge that can we move this collaborative learning online? Now, some people may say that with technology's help, online collaboration might be easier. So my question to you is, do you think online collaboration is easier or more difficult than face-to-face collaborative learning? So, okay. So I see people have face-to-face for idea gathering, both face-to-face and online, both face-to-face and online. So if you have a mixed model of either both face-to-face and online collaborative tasks, do you think online is easier than face-to-face in terms of design, in terms of management, or is it more difficult? Online is more difficult from Xingyi. Depends on the learner's preference. Face-to-face is easier. And what types of collaboration, how we structure, provide guidance, absolutely. Online more difficult. Now, I can imagine why some of us might think online is more difficult because that is the truth. When we enter a classroom, when we sit around a table with our group mates, we immediately get the group pressure, we have the peer pressure, we have to produce something. So there is a physical setting there that we can start collaborating immediately. But with online, I'm sure everyone also experienced that during this critical period of time, that you have to do your collaboration work online. There are a lot of challenges. And how do we design a online collaborative task to address those challenges, to not only achieve the collaborative level that we can normally achieve in the classroom, but to some extent also get better results through this online means. That is the challenge that I also want to focus on in the next couple of minutes by, again, using one of the example from the same course, CCSC 903, that I talked about last week. Now, if you remember last time I showed this learning sequence from CCSC 903, we move from online videos to knowledge check questions, and there is a small group gathering in the middle, which we call tutorials. It's a compulsory component at Hong Kong U, and then we have the face-to-face big whole class gathering. Now, this is a real challenge we faced last year because last year the course was entering a cross-institutional sharing project, which means on top of the 120 students we're taking in normally for the course, we're also taking in 25 additional students from other institutions. So we were expecting 145 students for that cohort. This makes this face-to-face small group tutorials even more difficult to execute because the tutorials are scheduled for 50-minute session per session, and each tutor can maximally take care of 3 groups. So by increasing the number of students, we either needed more tutors or some of our tutors needed to take more sessions. And this was something that we didn't want to add burden on to the teaching team. And because we are the team working on e-learning design, so we wanted to figure out a way to move this activity online. In a sense, to make this traditionally face-to-face small group collaborative task into an online collaborative task. Now, here, I want to introduce to you this community of inquiry model. Now, I have to be honest that we did not immediately go to a theoretical model when we started designing. We started working on the task we had and balance all of the constraints we had at the moment, the number of students and the available technologies, all kinds of considerations. So we went on with the task design, but later on we discovered this model which perfectly captures what we were doing. And then we based on this model to refine the design and eventually delivered it to the students. Now, like I said, this model is probably the most sophisticated compared to the previous 2 sessions. So instead of giving you 5 seconds, I will briefly walk you through this theoretical model. Now, this is a conceptual model introduced by Garrison in the year 2000. So it's a 20-year-old theoretical model compared to many of the other learning theories is relatively young. And also, most importantly, this model emerged in the age of computer conferencing. That's what people called discussion forum in the year 2000. So Garrison and his team, based on their experiences in e-learning, in distance learning, and computer conferencing, they analyzed the transcripts on the discussion forum, and they labeled the communications, the types of content being put into the discussion forum, and they generated this conceptual framework to capture what is happening in this virtual learning space. Now, on the top right corner, we have the cognitive presence, which is usually most familiar to us who design face-to-face activities. Basically meaning what kind of instructions you're giving, basically meaning that what kind of task you're giving, what kind of tasks students are performing in order to achieve the cognitive learning outcomes. And on the left-hand side, you have the social presence. And here it means that not only students have the social support, they have a group existing, but also this group has certain group coherence. They are encouraging each other. They are performing certain tasks together towards a shared goal. And lastly, you have the teaching presence, which is teachers giving clear instructions, giving guidance, providing support, and also the design of the task is intentionally directing students toward the learning outcome. Now, with all of these three presence interrelating to each other, you can create a truly meaningful educational experience through online discussion forum. Now, as I mentioned, this is emerged from computer conferencing, and the model is basically based on text analysis. So it has a lot of reference for us to create something that is text-based. We're not using video conferencing. We're not using any other fancy technologies. We're simply asking students to input text and to communicate with each other. So we made reference to this model to redesign the face-to-face tutorials and make it into an online collaborative task. In order to help you to have a understanding of that, I'm going to briefly show you how the tutorial worked previously. Just like any other small class, we have one tutor, 3 groups, each group with 4 to 5 students, and then we gave each group one problem set. Now, these 3 different problem sets are interrelated, so they're working on something slightly different, but they're following a very similar structure. And the duration is 50 minutes. Usually, it begins with tutors giving instructions and explain the problems, and then each group start working on their own problems, and then tutor will work around, provide support whenever necessary. And then in the last 30 minutes, each group will report back their solutions and also their problem-solving process. And then tutor sums up, and other groups can also give feedback to the presenting groups. Now, this is what typically was happening in the face-to-face tutorial. Making reference to the model we have just introduced, we redesigned this work to make it completely online. Now, first of all, to think about the cognitive presence, which is the task design. The reason we had 3 problem sets before is because we didn't want 3 groups to work on the exact same problem and repeat their solution. Very likely they're going to come up with similar solutions, so we don't want them to feel bored. But now with the online setting, they each work on their own problem sets. There's no such concern. So instead of using different problem sets, we adapted the 3 problem sets and merged them into one problem. And then using this problem, we add a discussion question in replacement of the reporting back session. So what students will be doing is that they will have a big task broken down into several smaller questions. And then at the end, they will have a discussion question to talk about their problem-solving process. And the next is social presence. how do we help students to formulate a social setting that is similar to their collaboration that was happening in the small classroom? First of all is we give each person a assigned subproblems. So everyone needs to respond to at least one problem, and they write their name next to that problem. So in that sense, you are responsible to solving part of the problem. And then teams are encouraged to use the suggesting and commenting function to discuss with each other. So when students are answering questions in Google Doc, they need to provide input based on each other's comments. And this part is also, this is something that we highly encourage and also we're taking into consideration in the assessing process. And lastly, the teaching presence is in the clearly written instruction and the formatted Google Doc, which I will show you in a minute. And also constant feedback and support in the Google Doc. And lastly, assessment based on the participation record documented in the Google Doc. Now this talking is clearly making things a little bit complicated, so let's jump into a template of one of the classwork that we have produced. Now here you have, each group will receive an individual formatted worksheet like this. And this is session 3. So session 3 is building on another problem in session 2. So we have 6 questions in total, and question 6 is the discussion question. Now students can enter in the answer box, and anyone can respond to each other's topic in each of the boxes. Now this looks like a very straightforward design. What made it effective is the execution process. Now here, we call this session, instead of tutorial, an online theory session, which is to highlight the fact that everything is conducted online. So again, we have one tutor, but this time, because we have each group, the groups are working on the same document, each tutor can take care of 4 to 5 groups. And the group size is the same, they work on one problem set, and the duration, because of the online nature, was much more extended. So we give students 1 week to work on the entire problem. On Sunday, the class is on Saturday, so the learning circle begins on Sunday. On Sunday, we release the problem to each group, and then by Wednesday, the tutor will come in to check their progress and provide feedback. Now, between Sunday and Wednesday, they are free to enter their input anytime, but by Wednesday, if any student hasn't do anything, the tutor will send a reminder email, either by tagging them in the Google Doc or sending the email directly to the students. And then on Thursday, the tutor will check again for the progress and then help them to construct to their final answers. At this point, if anyone still hasn't started, they should be in big trouble. And on Friday, we lock the Google Doc from editing. If you're familiar with Google Doc, you should know this functioning. We lock the Google Doc from editing, so they will only be able to read the comments and read the feedback from tutor. And at this point, tutor will start grading the assessment, their participation based on the Google Doc log. And lastly, on the Saturday in the whole class meeting, the instructor will address the whole class some of the commonly observed issues from the work, and also provide some deep dive questions based on what we have done in this week. Now, again, I'm gonna show you a quick example of what would happen in such a Google Doc. Now, this is one of my very heated discussed group. As you can see, after some group mates input their answers, students would raise questions, and they would discuss with each other using the comment box. Now, it does not mean that everyone would be so proactive. So at times I will jump in to prompt someone to provide further input. Oops. So after these 2 students have been actively discussing for a long time, I started tagging the other people to join the discussion as the deadline is drawing close. Now, this particular practice of having tutors come in to provide feedback and also to remind students to participate have worked effectively in the past year when we have done this forms of online collaborative tasks for 2 years, and it has worked effectively because having the teacher supervising your progress and checking your work all the time proved to be a very strong motivator for the students to contribute. And at the same time, the tutors were reporting that they were spending less time, but in a more effective meaning. Because when we conduct a face-to-face tutorial, oftentimes we spend a lot of time managing the logistics, going over the problems again and again. But now we only look at students' meaningful input and give feedback based on that. And with the 1 week duration, we can check in anytime we want and also providing more constructive feedback based on that. And we can clearly see where each student is standing and where we could provide more support to each one of them. So my time is running out a little bit, so I'm gonna quickly talk about this tool that we built based on this activity. Like I mentioned, this activity has been carried out for the past 2 years, and we clearly like the idea and also like the execution, but the only shortcoming is that it was a lot of work. Now, 145 students, meaning that we had 28, 29 groups each semester. And for each of the assignment, we had to create a unique document for each group. So because it's a group of engineers and engineers hated repetitive work, so we came up with ways to automate this process. This project is supported by a Hong Kong U teaching development grant. So my colleague and I, we developed this collaborative online learning design interface, which I apologize for the low resolution images because the platform is currently under upgrades. Can't take any screenshot at the moment. So these are from quite a while ago from a paper we published. So in the beginning phase, we create the Google Docs in this creation page by entering different questions. And then after that, the platform will automatically authorize students of each group and send them the documents. And after they start working on their activity, this group activity dashboard will tell us how many words of revision, how many words of comments are being done in each group's document. And also let us know how many active students are in this group. So this gives us an immediate feedback to know which group to get into, give detailed feedback, and which students we need to remind. And also when I mentioned that on Wednesday, we'll send reminder emails to idle students. This is the interface for us to identify these students and these groups and use the platform to send reminder emails to them immediately. Now, all of these is based on a real observation of the class and real needs emerged from this process. By using these automated process, we're able to save the time of the admin task and able to achieve the same level of effectiveness we have observed in the previous online theory sessions. Now, lastly, I want to briefly touch on the social metacognition aspect. Now, by social metacognition here, I want to focus on the aspect of it being the shared belief of a community. Now, one of the goals of us developing collaborative work and also helping students form their collaboration skills is because of this belief that when they eventually enter the workforce, when they're in their professions, this is a critical skill for them to bring really effective, really valuable products and create meaningful impact to the world. So we want them to not only achieve these tasks, but also establish this recognition. So one way, I think the most effective way is probably by cultivating this collaborative norm. Now, that's one thing that we have been trying to do with the course we're teaching, and also we're trying to share this message across our online design with MOOCs and also other forms of e-learning, that you need to rely on each other for you to produce anything that's meaningful. Now, what I say here might be a little bit soft, so I'm going to share with you a quick quote from a student taking CCST 9003. And I think she very nicely summarized what it means by a collaborative norm.
You're not there to do everything yourself, and you're not there to be expected to arrive to the solution. You go through the solution by discussing with the groupmate, and you can learn from each other.
I would change my mindset. Maybe they have different backgrounds from me, they have different understanding. So we have to find some common way for us to communicate.
So I think these two students pretty much summarized what we wish to achieve at a social metacognition level, is that they not only achieved a good project, but at the same time, they started valuing this process as something they can take away and have a longer impact on their future career. So we've come to the summary of this session. Of course, in the beginning, we talked about collaboration as a learning outcome, how you need to look at it as if it's a content learning outcome, it's a cognitive learning outcome. You need to define the instruction, define the measurables of this collaboration process. And also, it requires complex design with certain considerations. And community of inquiry model is a useful guide for you to design your collaborative task. And lastly, a repetitive or a collaborative culture requires us to create a norm of this norm creation of collaborative learning environment. And this is what we wish to ultimately achieve in helping students develop their collaborative skills. Now, I've repeated the word collaboration, collaborative too many times today, so my mouth is getting really mouthful with that. Now, at the end of these 3 sessions, as I promised, I have attached this little mind map to help you wrap things together. As I talked, we used a more pragmatic approach to look at learning design as a project. And then we went down the detailed pedagogical approach to make sure all of our learning outcomes are addressed. And lastly, in today's session, we go to a more philosophical level. We talk about the long-term impact. We talk about what students can also take away other than just the content knowledge and the skills. So hopefully these can be helpful for your own design and also for your own career. Before I finish, I do have a few more words to share as a slightly more experienced learning designers than yourself. First of all, learning design is a interdisciplinary skill set, which means most of the times you're not just approaching it from an educational perspective. You need to integrate all of the methodologies from other disciplines for you to really communicate with the content expert, for you to communicate with students so that you can reach a very desirable learning outcome. And the next is to use evidence-based practices. Now, as a young learning designer, who I still am, I consider, sometimes we have great ideas, but 99% of the time, your ideas have already been tried. So look for researchers, look for best practices, look for learning designers' blogs to look at what people have tried and how their feedback is, what their recommendation is. It's very important for you to quickly get on board with a certain standard practice. And to use design thinking to guide your practice. If you're unfamiliar with this term, it's a good time to start learning about it. The design thinking framework offers you a very useful skill set to tackle a problem which is usually open-ended and to help you find the right tool and the right solution to it. And lastly, as I mentioned, that we were starting to use this automated platform to issue these online theory sessions, I highly recommend everyone to learn something about AI if you haven't. If talking about AI is something very novel to you, it is time to get started. And speaking of this learning, these are some other learning resources that I consider very, very relevant and very helpful for any learning designers. I've linked all of them in this slide. You can download and take a look. And these are all resources from Coursera, and I'm a big fan of Coursera's learning design. So see if you can find help not only just in the content, but also the design of these courses. So lastly, thank you very much for having me, and it's a great pleasure talking with you, sharing all of these insights, the experiences with you. If you would like to stay connected, here's my LinkedIn and my WeChat, and also email and my YouTube channel, which I'm just starting to try to create some content. So thank you again very much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond to.